All right, so let's get using these prefabs of whatever model you had for your game. So I'm gonna throw a prefab on here, except I'm gonna update this prefab because I didn't want to give you too much information previously. So I'm just gonna zero out the X and the Z, and that should still be zeroed out, so we're fine there. I want to add another component because we need to get this bamboo moving, okay? We've got it set up for collisions, but we need to make sure that it can move. And I know what you're thinking. We just use the character controller to make our character move, but we want to stay away from character controller if we're not trying to move our character. If we're not using any input-based movements, we don't really want to use character controller. There are better ways to go about it. And so for this prefab, we're going to add a component, and we're going to add in a rigid body. And honestly, rigid body works pretty much the same as a character controller. They're both kind of physics-based movements, except one way to remember it is character controller is great for your character, hence the name, the main player. Rigid bodies are great for movement for things that's like NPCs or just objects in your game, things that we're not directly controlling but maybe interacting with. Now, I've updated this prefab because it didn't have a rigid body component in the last video, and now it does. So if I was to take another prefab, this one doesn't have a rigid body. I want all of my prefabs to have rigid bodies. So make sure we're all zeroed out. And if you click and drag this back to create a new prefab, you can basically click and drag it over the old prefab, and now it's updated to include this rigid body component. So now any piece of bamboo I stick in here will have the rigid body component. Okay? All right, that's fine and dandy, but we need to get movement. We've got the components, now how do we use it? And we could just kind of use like the same script from the other balls, but maybe it's a good idea to just start from scratch and just refresh some things. So if you're okay, I'm going to just completely delete those placeholder game balls. And they did good justice for us, and now we can put them to rest. I will open up a, we can reuse the scripts. We'll make new scripts in the future here. Let's just open one up. I've deleted this script. I've deleted all the code from it just so I can restart, just to make my life easier. So yeah, just going through the process again. If I want to make this thing move, I need a speed, right? And we know that we create our variables with public, and we know that float just means a big fancy number that can have decimals. And I'm going to set the speed, and I think I previously had mine at 0.5 f. F means float, so don't forget that. And we learned, this is why I want to go through this process again, we learned about communicating with the character controller component on our main character. We needed to basically reference this component so that we could talk to it in our code. So same with the rigid body, right? I've got a rigid body component. I need to talk to the rigid body because we're going to move using the rigid body. So once again, up here, I can go public rigid body, and a good default name for the rigid body is just RB. Sorry. So anytime I want to communicate with any of these properties or use any of the built-in methods of the rigid body, this is my access. This is what I'm going to go through. This is the name that I'm interested in. And you'll be happy to know that rigid body actually has more built-in physics than the character controller. So we're almost done here. We don't actually have to write too much code to get this person to move or to get this bamboo to move. Much like our move method using the character controller, there is a move method, although it's not called move, but there's a similar method that we can use for the rigid body. So back into the bamboo move, the rigid body move, we're going to access the rigid body through its name. So we're just going to type in RB, or if you called it something different. A method that's almost called the same thing. It is called move, but we can use move position. So this is how we move the rigid body. And we need to enter a few things, and it's almost the exact same as the move method for the character controller, where we just take a vector and times it by speed and add in the correction factor with the time delta time. Except this thing requires just one little extra thing. We need to communicate and get the current position of this rigid body. So using rb.position will give us the current position of that rigid body. I just repeated myself. This is a vector 3, right? This is a 3D vector, so it's got 3 coordinates attached to it. And so I'm going to take the current position and I'm going to add to it the position I want to go. So just like last time, we could go vector 3 dot forward. Maybe we're interested in going in the forward direction, you know, the Z minus direction. And how fast are we going to go? Well, we're going to go the speed. What's the speed? Well, we already stated the speed up there. And just so this runs uniformly, consistently on every computer, we're going to add in our correction factor. So you might be thankful that we're using rigid body because we can get movement with just one line of code. And the rest of the physics are kind of taken care of, whereas we had to do a little bit more heavy lifting with the character controller. Let's test it out. Oops. Now, just remember, there's a few things we have to do, right? I have to attach player 1 script to this guy. Now, I don't want it on the prefab. I don't want every prefab to have a player 1 script. We'll deal with that later. So don't make a new prefab. Just keep the player 1 script on this particular prefab. I've got my 0.5 and I've got my rigid body. Which rigid body are we talking about? Well, I'm talking about this one, the one that's on the prefab. So we remember we have to take and link it up there. All right, let's see how this works. Hopefully we get some movements. We've got the script attached to it. We've got the rigid body synced up. And we get forward movement, but you could see the rigid body physics are taking over. Fear not, for the rigid body comes equipped with all of your customization needs. We can go to the constraints and we could freeze the rotations of all 3 directions. And that way we won't have any rumbling and tumbling, although we still get movement and we still get collisions, and I can kind of push it and box it around a little bit, and it's gonna hit the wall there. And there you go. That's the bamboo. So rigid body, very cool. And now you know how to kind of customize it a little bit. But yeah, character controller for your main character, rigid body for physics-based movement for certain game objects in your game that need them.